Chapter 1. On the Way to African Musical Aesthetics. Provided that what has been said about being philosophically introduced to Africa makes sense, one is already initiated into the way of African musical aesthetics. As previously stated, such an introduction does not amount to presenting to someone what is totally foreign. Even where one is African, there's always more for one to learn. One finds oneself on the way to African musical aesthetics without knowing precisely how one finds oneself there. In finding oneself on this way, one also finds others on it, just as one is found by others on it. The way draws us onto self. The time and place for this drawing varies from individual to individual and from cultural tradition to cultural tradition. Yet this variation also may be this variation may also be said not to be a variation. The time and place of each individual is the time and place for every other individual, and the time and place for each cultural tradition is the time and place for every other cultural tradition. Accordingly, the way to the African musical aesthetics is the way to all other musical aesthetics. If this is not immediately self-evident, it is because our understanding of the African musical aesthetics, as is the case with our understanding of other musical aesthetics, is inadequate. Hopefully, in what follows, this inadequacy will be illuminated aesthetically. It must be illuminated this way, for it is aesthetics that is at stake. It is only aesthetically that one can be guided truthfully to aesthetics. Moreover, one can be so guided if one is aesthetically self-guiding. If one were to ask how one is to guide oneself aesthetically, the answer comes from aesthetics. If this answer is not satisfying, this satisfaction may have something to do with what one understands as aesthetics or with how one understands aesthetics. That is, one is implicated in the question as to how one is to be guided by aesthetics. For the African, the way to African musical aesthetics is the way to the African's innermost way of being. It is at the same time the outermost way of being African, the outer of the inner and the inner of the outer. It is life pulsating in the African. On this way, the African stands out. The African stands out in his or her uniqueness as an African, and at the same time, he or she stands out in the light of what is human. The uniqueness does not reflect alienation from other human beings. It is a uniqueness that stands out as the site for the solidarity with other human beings. That is, the way of African musical aesthetics is the way of all human beings. To find oneself drawn into this way is to find oneself drawn into the being of other human beings as a way of being drawn onto oneself. This being drawn is not a mere passive event on the part of the one who is so drawn. Prior to being drawn on the way of African musical aesthetics, one is not. In being drawn, one comes to be. Thus, the way of African musical aesthetics is a constitutive way, but the way itself does not exist prior to the event of constituting. It becomes what it is in the event of constituting. To find oneself on the way to African musical aesthetics is to find the way to African musical aesthetics. We await this way, as this way awaits us. Awaiting in either case is not passive. It is an awaiting that transcends the dichotomy of the passive and the active. It is a constituting awaiting. Being drawn by and onto the way of African musical aesthetics is not a humanistic event. In this event, what is human is subsumed under the non-human and becomes one with it. Thus, when it is said that one finds oneself on the way to the African musical aesthetics, finding oneself on the way is finding oneself on the way not only with other human beings, but also with all that is. This being with all that is enters into the constitution of what is human and reveals what is human as belonging to what is non-human. The way to the African musical aesthetics is not a human way. It is not created by human beings. In it, human beings are created. The creator is not a god or a goddess, since gods and goddesses too find themselves on this way as creatures. The creator is not a being among other beings, and it is not a supreme being. The creator is anonymous. What the word creator names is unnameable. This unnamability permeates the way of African musical aesthetics, and it is as such that one finds oneself in it. The anonymity and the unnamability of the creator affect the being of the African in such a way that he or she becomes the embodiment of anonymity and unnamability. In the Western world, scholarship on African musical aesthetics appears to be dominated by anthropologists and, more specifically, by ethnomusicologists. Since I am neither an anthropologist nor an ethnomusicologist, what follows is not primarily intended to be anthropological or ethnomusicological, nor is it primarily addressed to anthropologists or ethnomusicologists. To subject African musical aesthetics to ethnomusicology is to prioritize ethnicity as the groundwork. To subject African musical aesthetics to ethnomusicology is to prioritize ethnicity as the groundwork for understanding African musical aesthetics. Such subjection caters to the prejudices of ethnicists. This subjection is largely the work of Western scholars who refuse to see Africa other than in terms of ethnicity. The proper ground for African musical aesthetics is musicology. What is said about it is, for the most part, addressed to musicologists, with the assumption that an address to musicologists is not a dictation to them. It is not a sermon to them. It is rather an invitation to a sensuous conversation on what is open. My professional training is neither in anthropology nor in ethnomusicology, and therefore I do not intend to speak with the tongue of somebody else, where I am more likely to make a fool of myself. My training is in philosophy, and by philosophy, I do not mean philosophy as a discipline among other disciplines in the academy. I do not mean a discipline that is side by side with ethnology, ethnography, or with anthropology in the academy. Moreover, when I say that I am addressing musicologists, I do not refer to scholars of music. By musicologists, I mean those who are philosophically attracted to music. The logos of music is philosophical. What being philosophical means in this case is a matter of music. Music draws philosophy into itself so that philosophy can speak of what is essential about music. But philosophy is so drawn because as it is drawn, it too draws music into its essence. I do not want to give the impression that in speaking with a philosophical tongue, I will necessarily avoid making a fool of myself. The formation of my philosophical tongue is yet to be complete, and this is primarily because a philosophical tongue is what it is by being in the process of being a philosophical tongue. Thus, the formation of a philosophical tongue is necessarily incomplete. What philosophers say, that, and this includes what they say about philosophy, necessarily lacks finality. The perimeter of the philosophical community, as is the case with the perimeter of philosophical speech, remains inexact. To construe this perimeter professionally or academically is fashionable in the West. Excludes those. To construe this perimeter professionally or academically, as is fashionable in the West, excludes those who are not a part of the academy, or those who have not passed through the portals of the academy from the philosophical community. Such exclusion may be culture specific and should not be construed as constituting a definitive statement on the home of philosophy. Any pretension to exclusivity stands in need of philosophical justification. Without such justification, it can reasonably be assumed that it is based on a non-philosophical and perhaps anti-philosophical criteria. Academic philosophy does not encompass the venue of philosophy, and consequently, it does not exhaust the venue of philosophical training. Thus, it should not be assumed that there is no academy, or where there has been no academy, there is neither philosophy nor philosophical training. The search for African musical aesthetics is exclusively in the academy disregards the multiple places where this aesthetics is constituted and exhibited. Thus, if one looks for African musical aesthetics solely in texts that have been produced by those who are associated with the academy, one may be ignorant of what constitutes the text of African musical aesthetics, or where this text is exhibited. One reads what is written about African musical aesthetics at the risk of one's understanding of African musical aesthetics. To be sure, this includes this writing. In writing, there may be a presence or an absence of African musical aesthetics. Where there is a presence, the process of writing about African musical aesthetics must be aesthetically musical, and it must be African. It must be experienced as such. It is this lived experience that constitutes this process as what it is. It is in the context of this constitution that this process is to be understood. Where music, aesthetics, and African intersect is where this process takes place. It appropriates music, aesthetics, and Africa as processes. In Africa, this intersection takes place in the practice of living. An African philosopher comes into relief in this practice and does so in the company of fellow Africans. There are many ways of getting onto and into the way of African musical aesthetics. To the extent that each way leads to the way of African musical aesthetics, the way of African musical aesthetics claims each and all of them as its own. Each is a way because it is a way to the way. It is my intention to approach African musical aesthetics in a philosophical way. My training is in philosophy, and therefore what follows should primarily be understood and assessed from a philosophical standpoint. However, what a philosophical standpoint is not to be taken for granted. Much remains to be said about it. A true philosophical speech is not exhaustive. It has a horizontal aspect. Moreover, as an African standpoint, what is African about it must be taken into consideration. What is African is equally horizontal. For the serious student of philosophy, the criterion for what constitutes a philosophical standpoint or philosophical training is still subject to contestation. Undoubtedly, what I say about African musical aesthetics is guided by a criterion for what constitutes a philosophical standpoint and by a criterion of what constitutes philosophical training. There are those who would deem it wise for me to state what criterion that is herein presupposed. Although this is a reasonable expectation, instead of stating the criterion explicitly, I would do so implicitly. What follows is, in part, intended to state what criterion is used. It is up to readers to arrive at their own conclusion as to what criterion is in use. In so saying, I am not conceding that the criterion for what is philosophical is an arbitrary one. It is an indication that such a criterion is not to be imposed by any one philosopher onto other philosophers. To the extent that one is a philosopher, he or she is essential in its establishment. The criterion of what is philosophical is a philosophical problem that calls for a solution from everyone who is truly philosophical. It is not necessary that one begins by asserting what one understands by philosophy before one undertakes a philosophical work. If a work is philosophical, it testifies to what a philosophical work is. The whole work provides internal evidence as to what makes a work philosophical. Those who read a philosophical work bring into it their own understanding of what a philosophical work is. And if it happens that their understanding of philosophy is different from the author's, it is doubtful if they can be persuaded that they are reading a philosophical work. What is essential to a philosophical persuasion is that the persuader and those to be persuaded have a degree of shared understanding of what makes work philosophical. To be sure, it cannot be determined a priori whether or not there exists a shared understanding of what makes a work philosophical. A shared understanding emerges in the course of a dialogue with the work. What guides one in philosophical understanding of aesthetics is a philosophical aesthetic understanding. A shared understanding is a prerequisite for fruitful guidance. There is little that has been written either in the West or in Africa by philosophers in the area of African musical aesthetics. The Western philosophers, qua philosophers, are, for the most part, ignorant of, indifferent to, or perhaps, and even more so, disdainful of African aesthetic life. They are, for the most part, homebound. They are preoccupied with philosophy as it is practiced in the Western tradition, and those who are interested in aesthetics are primarily interested in Western aesthetic life. African academic philosophers are yet to fully emancipate themselves from the regime of Western philosophy to be in the position to fully embark upon the task of carrying out a serious philosophical investigation of African musical aesthetic life from an African standpoint. To the contemporary African, what such a standpoint is remains elusive, partly due to the historical circumstance in which he or she finds him or herself. At present, the dearth of written African philosophical literature is undeniable, but the written is not the only source of philosophy. There is an African oral tradition, as well as an African life generally, that presents enormous resource for philosophical investigation. Book fetishism in the West has spread to Africa, and a good number of African philosophers have become converts. By being converts, they have become oblivious to the non-written indigenous source of philosophical research. They have become oblivious to the fact that articles, journals, magazines, monographs, and books are not the only media for the repository of the fruits of philosophical research. The non-written that is left out is not exhausted by what is oral. There's also the non-oral and the non-written that is the repository of philosophical work, and that is a site for philosophical investigation. It should also be borne in mind that what one is also central to what philosophy investigates, and clearly one does not want to take the position that one exists solely in the written word. One does not want to say that I am a book, therefore I exist. Moreover, if we bear in mind that aesthetics claim what we are, it is ridiculous to investigate aesthetics exclusively in what is written, as if what is written is the exclusive domain of aesthetics. Aesthetics is our way of being the world, and it is primarily found in every way in which we are manifested in the world. Primarily, music does not exist to be read or in a written form. It is lived. The meagerness of what is written about African philosophical musical aesthetics has been and is projected by Westerners as a serious liability for Africans. What may readily be forgotten is that the meagerness of what is written is not necessarily an indicator of the meagerness of the African philosophical musical aesthetics. Writing is but one of the theaters for the exhibition of the African philosophical musical aesthetics. In this regard, the Africans who are interested in securing and articulating African philosophical musical aesthetics should affirm and defend the multiplicity of the theaters of the African musical aesthetics. They should look inwardly, tap, and defend the indigenous African theaters. In doing so, they will have counterparts in the non-Western world where the same defense is flourishing. Ultimately, in Africa, what is defended here is a sense of being African. For others, it is the sense of being who they are. The theaters of African musical aesthetics are the theaters of being African. To defend them is to defend being African. As a philosophical defense, the defense must be inspired by what is indigenous to Africa. This inspiration remains compromised by Western inspiration. Most African academic philosophers continue to seek philosophical inspiration in the West. In this orientation, they are joined by some of their counterparts in Asia and in Latin America. If their counterparts in these parts of the world do not take African philosophy seriously, in part, it is due to a perverted sense of the source of philosophical inspiration. One finds there the same imperial victimization as one finds in Africa. Sensitivity to this victimization and the desire to overcome it is a part of what drives the quest for indigenous philosophizing. The objective is to establish an autonomous philosophical identity, partly as a reaction to Western European philosophical tutelage. In Africa, the work of philosophy ought to be primarily the work of Africans. The flowering of philosophical works in other traditions cannot be a substitute for what needs to be done in Africa by Africans. Given the current status of thinking in the world, a status in which what matters is what is in print, non-Africans are likely to have only marginal interest in this work. The current African cultural landscape is not distinguished by writing. In the art of writing today, Africans remain marginalized, and hence their work tends to be marginalized. If it is borne in mind that the written text is not the only medium or the only depository of philosophical work, the scarcity of African written philosophical sources is not insurmountable. Is not an insurmountable obstacle in carrying out philosophical work in Africa. Writing is only one of the venues of philosophy, and failure to recognize this fact may lead to a misconstruction of what philosophy is. Even if there were ample written literature on African philosophy, one ought to bear in mind that a philosopher is not primarily a scholar. He or she does not solely distinguish himself or herself in tinkering with what others have written or what others have said. A philosopher is creative, and even when he or she is not, he or she serves to remind us that there is philosophical life before and after scholarship. It is in creating that a philosopher establishes an essential link with a musician, and conversely, it is only as creative that a musician establishes an essential link with a philosopher. The link situates the philosopher as a site where the truth of music is rendered philosophically accessible. Undoubtedly, there's going to be enormous amount of scholarship on African musical aesthetics. Nevertheless, I would like to propose that what is essential about African musical aesthetics is beyond scholarship. What is essential about African musical aesthetics is what animates scholarship on African musical aesthetics. Scholarship on African musical aesthetics generates what is essential about African musical aesthetics when it effaces itself as scholarship, so that what is essential about African musical aesthetics can come into relief. The effacement is not a negation of scholarship. It is the completion of every successful scholarship. Every scholarship is a presentation, and as such, it is subservient to what it presents. Scholarly presentation should not be confused with philosophical presentation. The latter presents itself in what it presents as belonging to it. Using a scholarly criterion for judging the philosophical merit of a philosophical work devalues such a philosophical work. To judge such a work, one requires a philosophical criterion. The power of the ideology of scholarship in the West has reached unparalleled level in the history of humankind. Under this ideology, the African philosopher has been and is pressured and compelled to distinguish himself or herself as a scholar. The inability to distinguish himself in this manner renders his or her philosophical credentials suspect. If, however, the distinction between a scholar and a philosopher is to be maintained, which it must, To secure what is essential about a philosopher, the African philosopher must resist at all costs the pressure and compulsion to be nothing more than a scholar, even if this leads to being excluded from the company of those who have reduced philosophy to scholarship. See, the desire for inclusion in the community of philosophers is one of the major driving forces in African philosophizing today. The dominant community of philosophers, at least in the academic world, has been constructed by Western philosophers, and the entrance into it is strictly guarded by them to ensure that those who seek membership in it meet criteria that they set up. African philosophers who desire to be included in this community run the risk of serving philosophical interests that are antithetical to African philosophy. The desire may have been planted in Africans by Western European colonial and neo-colonial practices. Pursuing the objective of this desire may alienate African philosophers not only from an authentic community of African philosophers, but also from the authentic communities of non-Western philosophers. It reinforces the hegemonic pretenses of the community of Western European philosophers. Given the historical condition that African philosophers find themselves today, their historic task is to identify this objective and the desire that generates it and destroy both of them. It is in this context of this task that African philosophers can construct, investigate, and interpret. See, it is in this context of this task that African philosophers can construct, investigate, and interpret African musical aesthetics without alienating themselves as Africans. It is especially important that African philosophers be mindful of who their audience is. Prior to European invasion of Africa, Africans addressed one another. With the invasion, an attempt was made to destroy this form of address. A new form of address was instituted, an address in which Africans were forced to attend to European monologue, which is to what Europeans were saying to one another. In the world of scholarship, Africans were compelled to read what was generated by Europeans for other Europeans. A basis was laid for incorporating African musical aesthetics in a scholarly world that Europeans constructed. It is in this context that African ethnomusicology arose. Scholarship, it should not be forgotten, has been an important resource in carrying out the work of Western cultural imperialism in Africa. The African struggle against Western imperialism in Africa must include the adoption of an attitude towards scholarship that does not further the degradation of Africans. It is not that the African has to be anti-scholarship. It is simply a matter of recognizing the politics of scholarship. That is, a matter of recognizing the extent to which scholarship is a deployment of power, and then ensuring that the prevailing deployment is not at the expense of Africans. We seriously misconstrue scholarship if we solely construe it exclusively as writing, reading, interpreting, or commenting on a written text. This construction conceals a cultural stance that is affirmed at the expense of other cultural stances. It is one face of the politics of culture. In what follows, there is no pretension on my part to carry out a scholarly pursuit. I see myself as doing the work of philosophy. I see myself as a participant in the continuation of a philosophical speech on the African musical aesthetics. I deliberately use the term participation, not only because I recognize that the task is too enormous for me or for any one person, but also because this is the way things are done in Africa. What is essential in Africa for Africans is done by Africans cooperatively. Assuming that it is what is essential that is at stake in African musical aesthetics, a speech on African musical aesthetics is a speech that must be carried out in a cooperative spirit. To be African, this speech cannot be a one-man show. The engagement of others is indispensable. These others include not only the living out, but also the dead and those who are not yet born. African musical aesthetics is, in a sense, expression and affirmation of such an engagement. To the extent that non-Africans are a part of the audience, they too are important in the constitution of this speech. If the audience is merely passive, it cannot experience what is essential about African musical aesthetics. Thus, in the deepest and broadest sense, the creative work, the work from which the African musical aesthetics takes its shape, is a communal undertaking. It is fair then for me not to take exclusive credit, if one is deserved, for the speech on an African musical aesthetics that is generated herein. I am merely joining others in a communal effort, notwithstanding the pressure from the cult of individualism that is rampant today. The private speech is a preserve for the mad. In combating the idiocy of ethno-philosophy, Huntunji comes very close to joining this cult. Under the spell of Western European modernity, he fails to see how one can philosophize from a trans-individual standpoint without compromising one's individuality. He fails to see that community is not in every sense an aggregate of individuals, and also fails to see that an individual is an individual in a human community. That an individual can philosophize from the standpoint of community does not necessarily give rise to a bogus philosophy. The language of philosophy is a social language. It is a political language. It is a people's language. One may indeed appreciate Huntunji's attempt to call our attention to the ludicrous claim by ethno-philosophers, be they Westerners or Africans, that all Africans are unanimous in the way they think or in the way they perceive the world. However, one should avoid the equally ludicrous claim that a philosopher philosophizes in isolation from others, or that he or she engages as an isolated individual. The construction of an isolated individual can be just as fantastic as the construction of an anti-individual collectivity. Whether we like it or not, the language that we use to express our thought is a social phenomenon, and this phenomenon is primordially not an aggregate. Suppression of individualism is not necessarily a violation of human individuality. It may be an essential act for affirming genuine human individuality. The paranoia generated by excessive fear of ethno-philosophy should not lead to a maniacal worship of the individual. As previously indicated, my training is in philosophy, and that is a philosophical speech that should be expected from me. Those who are not trained in philosophy may incline to ask what a philosophical speech is. See, those who are not trained in philosophy may incline to ask what a philosophical speech is. It may come as news to them, but those who are trained in philosophy often find themselves asking the same question in a way that is essential to philosophical life. What a philosophical speech is not self-evident to philosophers. What a philosophical speech is remains an open question for philosophers, and the speeches that they generate are, in a way, attempts to answer it. This is indeed one of the objectives I am attempting to achieve in the speech on African musical aesthetics. When a philosopher says something essential about African musical aesthetics, it should be expected that he or she will say something essential about philosophy. In either case, what is said is not definitive, for what it is construed as essential is problematically so. There is also more to be said. Speech is intrinsically temporal. Its historicality is such that it appears to have no beginning and no end. To speak is to participate in this flow. It is in this flow that the life of speech blends into the life of music. Like speech, music is temporal. To be what they are, both are claimed by time. The second objective in generating this speech is to answer a second question, namely, what is aesthetics? African musical aesthetics is a branch of African aesthetics that derives its aestheticity from African aesthetics. Moreover, African aesthetics is itself a branch of aesthetics and derives its aestheticity from aesthetics. If this is granted, and in my view it has to, it is appropriate, in part, that I address the phenomena of African musical aesthetics from the standpoint of aesthetics in general. Differently stated, one who understands African aesthetics already understands aesthetics. In this claim, I do not intend to belittle or marginalize the particularity. I do not intend to belittle or marginalize the particularity of African musical aesthetics, if only because aesthetics in general has its locus in particularities of aesthetics. I am aiming at a deeper understanding of what is at stake in African musical aesthetics. Thirdly, there is a question as to what music is. It is not possible to fully understand African musical aesthetics if one has no clue as to what the essence of music is. What music is implicated in what is essential about African musical aesthetics. Provided that aesthetics is adequately understood, it may be a key to the understanding of music, and conversely, provided that music is properly understood, it may be a key to the understanding of aesthetics. Fourthly, because our concern is with African musical aesthetics, what an African is implicated in this concern. In figuring out what African musical aesthetics is, our speech will not be complete if we omit to bring into relief what an African is. Properly understood, aesthetics and music may be keys to the understanding of what an African is, provided that a proper understanding of what an African has taken place. One will already have an understanding of what it is to be a human being. What an African is not foreign to what any human being is. A study of African musical aesthetics is not intended to show that an African is a total stranger to other human beings. He or she is what he or she is by being with other beings in his or her being. One fails to fully recognize what is essential about African musical aesthetics and music if one does not see in either the logos of being human. We now see that the speech on African aesthetics is multifaceted. It is a speech of speeches. The task ahead of us is a formidable one, insofar as we have to ensure that the speech that is generated takes into account the speeches implicit in it. If I do not do justice to it, I hope you will understand why, and I hope you will bear in mind that the correctness of Aristotle's view that justice is a virtue to be practiced in the polis. An isolated individual is incapable of acting justly. Justice is or ought to be one of the virtues of a philosopher. I hope you are willing and ready to offer aid. I will have you take note that the speeches in the speech on African aesthetics are internally linked, and the pursuit of either is not to be taken as a digression from others, or from the main speech. Each speech is essential not only to other speeches but also to the main speech. If one is to speak of African musical aesthetics, one is more likely to say something essential if one is rooted in the world of African people. Insofar as one is making a philosophical speech, this rootedness must be philosophical, because rootedness has to be philosophical. One is already likely to run into the problematicity of this rootedness. A view has been spread in the West that the African world is not normally where one turns for understanding of philosophical rootedness. It is the position in the West that one normally turns to the Western world, or more recently to the Asian world. We are who Africans are. We are who Africans and in philosophy have found ourselves in a curious position of trying to figure out whether there is anything like African philosophy. Those who have been keeping track of this effort will probably agree with me that this effort has now reached a point where it is paralyzing African philosophers. To pursue it any further can only deepen this paralysis. The effort is currently generating boredom and is turning off many of us who cherish what is vital in African philosophy. It seems to me that the effort to figure out whether there is an African philosophy is in part a reaction to the Western chauvinism in philosophy. And if this reaction appears to have run out of steam, it is because it has failed to engage Western philosophers in a manner that would force them to re-examine what they have taken traditionally to be the nature of philosophy. More significantly, it has failed us in our effort at self-determination. Because it is a reaction, it does not arise from what is truly philosophical about us. Whatever else is accomplished in the speech I am generating, I hope that the speech will illuminate a proper grounding for African philosophy and also aid Western philosophers in re-examining the manner in which they have hitherto perceived and interpreted their philosophical grounding. To be sure, the letter may sound pretentious. Western philosophers are not used to receiving foreign aid in philosophical matters from non-Westerners, and such an aid from Africans would most likely strike Westerners as outrageously ridiculous. This dismissive attitude, however, may be symptomatic of a recent resistance against the pressure to the subject for what has for centuries been taken for granted. It may be a reflection of a dogmatism that has taken over the life of philosophy in the West. On our part, we Africans can emancipate ourselves from the curious position in which we find ourselves, not by pursuing a philosophical agenda that has been imposed on us, but by speaking from our own agenda. We should not constitute ourselves or allow ourselves to be constituted as beneficiaries of philosophical welfare from the West, or as beneficiaries of philosophical affirmative action from the West. The speeches that we generate should be our own contribution to the self-determination of African peoples. To the extent that African people stand in need of emancipation, the speeches should be emancipatory. My speech should be judged accordingly. To be authentic, a speech on African musical aesthetics must have an emancipatory effect both on the speaker and on the audience. I try to speak in a way that conveys my yearning for self-emancipation and in a way that seeks to awaken in others such a yearning. My emancipation and the emancipation of others are inseparable. Yearning for emancipation is an integral aspect of African musical aesthetics. An inquiry into the nature of aesthetics cannot be divorced from the tradition in which the inquirer is situated. On the one hand, it sheds light on the tradition of on the one hand, it sheds light on the tradition of which it is a part, and on the other hand, it sheds light on the inquirer insofar as he or she has a part in the tradition that forms the context of the inquiry he or she undertakes. As the human community is subject to diverse traditions, every inquiry into the nature of aesthetics finds itself bound to this or that tradition. To be sure, insofar as every tradition is a human tradition, the particularity of each tradition is never fully severed from other traditions. Each tradition is open to every other tradition. To the extent that each tradition is philosophical, it will preserve the openness it has with other traditions. What has been guiding and what guides this speech is the African tradition. At stake in the question of African musical aesthetics is the question of African tradition. The speaker is an African. Hopefully, the speech on African musical aesthetics will bring into aesthetic relief both the speaker and the African tradition. To the extent that the audience from other traditions understands their respective traditions as linked to the African tradition, they will not be total strangers to what is said. If, according to their understanding, such linkage does not exist, hopefully it will be forged in the course of this speech. Given the postmodern aversion to universalizing discourses, there may be those who will believe that it is absurd to speak of the African tradition. What may be fashionable is to speak about African traditions rather than to speak about the African tradition. What may be fashionable is to speak about African traditions rather than to speak about the African tradition. However, it cannot be assumed that any of these speeches necessarily excludes any other. There are those who would like to portray Africa as balkanized because it benefits them to think of her that way. Many Westerners have no problem in embracing the West as a monolithic tradition, but they find it absurd to embrace a monolithic view of Africa. Although one may legitimately advance the claim that the West constitutes a monolithic tradition, for example, due to a common Christian religion, the West has not been a monolith from time immemorial. Moreover, It is indeed possible today to construe the West as a mosaic, an aggregate of traditions. The construction of the West as a united entity has been used by Westerners to affirm their identity, and this affirmation has taken place in non-Western. The construction of the West as a united entity has been used by Westerners to affirm their identity, and this affirmation has taken place in opposition to non-Westerners. As long as this ideological war exists, it is important that Africans affirm themselves in a unitary way, even if it is granted that the African is a mosaic of traditions. There's possibility that Africans can work towards the unification of their traditions. If today is not absurd from Europeans to work towards African unity, it is not absurd for Africans to work towards African unity. Hence, in speaking about the African tradition, the speech is to be understood in a historical context and in the light of the ongoing internal organization and reorganization of the human community. It is precisely in this context that it is appropriate to speak of African philosophy rather than to speak about African philosophies. But again, the adoption of one speech does not necessarily exclude the other. One can sing the song of difference while singing the song of unity. The song of African musical aesthetics is multiple songs in this sense. The danger of misunderstanding is always present in what is said or in what is written. One always reads or listens at one's risk, but it is also the case, in part, one assumes that others will understand what one writes guarantees. One runs the risk of not only being misunderstood by others, one also runs the risk of misunderstanding oneself. The writer or the speaker is never in supreme command of what he or she writes or says. Lack of supremacy is an aesthetic attribute that a writer or a speaker must incorporate if he or she is to write or speak aesthetically. It inaugurates openness. The writer or the speaker does best of what he or she does by preserving openness as the innermost aspect of what is done. What is written, as is the case with what is orally said, always overflows what is intended in writing and speaking. This is not a defect. It is a part of the great openness of writing and speaking, a greatness that is a central aspect of the aesthetic phenomenon. It is this overflowing that constitutes the aesthetic dimension in the writer and in the speaker. The writer or the speaker is a part of the audience that he or she addresses. He or she can read or listen to himself or to herself. To write or to speak is to reach out to others. It is to forge a link with others. It is to reaffirm kinship with others. By reaching out to others, one reaches out to oneself. To write or to speak about African aesthetics is to presuppose that writing and speaking have an internal link with African musical aesthetics. If such a link is denied, the writing or speaking about African musical aesthetics can only move outside the parameters of African musical aesthetics. Such a movement cannot reveal what is essential about African musical aesthetics. The writing or the speaking that reveals what is essential about African musical aesthetics must arise from African musical aesthetics. It must be African, musical, and it must be aesthetic. How does one embody these three aspects in writing or in speaking? The question is not an idle one, for the answer lies at the heart of African musical aesthetics. It is, in part, an answer to the question regarding the nature of aesthetics. It is the nature of aesthetics that informs the question, and it is the aesthetics that guides the question onto itself. One cannot write about or speak about aesthetics without being guided by aesthetics. In writing or in speaking about aesthetics, one is called upon to dwell in the language of aesthetics. In so dwelling, one is claimed by aesthetics and thus able to write or speak about aesthetics aesthetically. The about in writing about or speaking about aesthetics is therefore not to be taken as being at a distance from aesthetics. Such a distance can only obscure the truth of aesthetics. In writing about aesthetics or in speaking about aesthetics, aesthetics does not present itself as a spectacle that the writer translates in writing or that the speaker translates into speech. One is a part of what one writes about, and one is a part of what one speaks about. Likewise, he or she for whom one writes or speaks about aesthetics cannot be at a distance from aesthetics. For being so distant, he or she will not be able to read, hear, or understand what is said about aesthetics. He or she for whom one writes or speaks about aesthetics must dwell in the same aesthetic language that the writer or speaker about aesthetics dwells in. Writing and speaking makes sense only if the writer or the speaker dwells in the same language as the reader or as the listener. The language of the aesthetics is a communal language and communalizes those who dwell in it. Those that call it into its abode have their private identity subsumed under a common identity. Aesthetics is, thus, highly personal and at the same time highly impersonal. The birth and the death of the individual in aesthetic life, the barrier between what is private and what is communal, breaks down and forges a unity of the individual and the communal, a unity that is enigmatic in that it retains the distinction between the communal and the individual. To write or to speak about aesthetics is to bring into relief this type of existence, this type of life that is both ordinary and extraordinary. Writing and speaking are vital processes. They are not simply mechanical activities undertaken by mechanical beings for the attainment of a mechanical end. Our inquiry on aesthetics centers on aesthetic life. By life, it is meant more than simply life as understood in biological sense. The concept of life is to guide us. The concept of life that is to guide us is one that is broad in scope and covers every aspect in which human beings affirm themselves as living beings. We are approaching aesthetics as a human ontology, as logos of human life. A human being is axiomatically an aesthetic being. Thus, when we inquire into aesthetics, we are inquiring into our being. We cannot, therefore, remain satisfied with the conventional Western claim that aesthetics concern themselves with the sensuous or is simply a matter of taste. Nor can we settle with the other conventional claim that aesthetics concerns itself with beauty and nothing more. The belief prevalent in the West that aesthetics concerns itself with beauty or with a criterion for what is beautiful strikes the African as superficial, unless beauty, as is the case with what is beautiful, is construed as an intrinsic feature of life or of existence. If the aesthetic concerns itself with the sensuous, it does so. See, if the aesthetic concerns itself with the sensuous, it does so to the extent that the sensuous carries the weight of what it is to be human. The sensuous exhibits our essence as human beings. It is what mirrors us to ourselves. Aesthetics is the locus of the phosphorescence of our being. Moreover, insofar as it is aesthetic life that is of concern to us, it is more appropriate to approach it as the phosphorescence of our life rather than the phosphorescence of our being. We are not involved here with a mere play of words. Life is not a thing, material or immaterial. To think of it either way is to violate it. It is what it is. Life is life. Being, to Africans, though I assume not exclusively to them, connotes objectness, opacity, and robs us of our openness and motility. The consciousness of which figures centrally in the phenomenon of life. The aesthetic world is a lived world. If aesthetic life is to mirror us, it must mirror us as living. We are insofar as we are living. More fundamental than Descartes' claim that we think, therefore we are. it must be asserted that we live, therefore we are. Thinking is only possible for the living. It is a feature of living, one among the many. And contrary to Descartes' view, a feature that does not stand out as the most distinctive feature of human life. The affirmation of the value of the life of thought at the expense of the rest of human life constitutes an injustice to human life, a life whose sanctity and integrity lies in its essential unity. If aesthetics is to claim and to be claimed by life as its very own, it can do so only to the extent that the Cartesian thinking is not allowed to have sway over us. This thinking is an abstraction that is cut off from the life in which the truth of aesthetics is embedded. To be sure, it may be argued that thinking is a distinctive form of life that must be distinguished from other forms if it is to be truly understood. But how is one to distinguish life from thinking from other forms of life without alienating the life of thinking from itself? What is to be rejected is an a priori understanding of the life of thinking. Philosophical thinking must avoid this thinking, a thinking that assumes that what the life of the thinking is self-evident. By paying close attention to African musical aesthetics, one may yet learn what the life of thinking is. Professional thinking, the thinking that one finds among academic philosophers, should not be mistaken for the genuine philosophical thinking. Genuine philosophical thinking is exhibited at a site where what is essential about subject matter of this thinking exhibits itself. African musical aesthetics can offer us such a site, provided that we allow ourselves to be fully claimed by it. It is essential that in aesthetics we steer away from singling out. It is essential that in aesthetics we steer away from singling out a specific aspect of living. We must, for example, abandon the notion that the inquiry into aesthetics is an intellectual undertaking. One can readily fall into the trap of this notion by regarding aesthetics as the subject matter for professional philosophy. Since philosophy is deemed to be an intellectual activity, under its domain, an inquiry into aesthetics may force one to reduce aesthetics to an intellectual phenomenon. Those who believe that aesthetic life is non-intellectual life may hereby seize the opportunity to oppose philosophical life to aesthetic life. This opposition appears to rest on the possible misconception of both philosophical life and aesthetic life. If, as previously indicated, aesthetic life is a mirror of human life, the unity that characterizes human life must be mirrored by and in aesthetic life. It is only in this manner that aesthetic life can adequately mirror human life. Life does not shield itself from itself. It is wholly translucent to itself. If philosophical life is to adequately address aesthetic life, it can do so only insofar as it is guided by the unity of life. It will be inadequate to task it. It would be inadequate to its task if it is guided by the intellectual alone. It is not by the intellect or on the account of the intellect that what is human distinguishes itself. If one is open to aesthetic life, one may, indeed, gain a more profound understanding of human life, and philosophical life itself may be in a position to grasp the human life and philosophical life itself may be in a position to grasp the essence of human life if it is grasped in its rootedness, in this profundity. Like aesthetic life, philosophical life is not simply the life of the intellect. It is the life of the whole person. It is only as a whole person that one philosophizes, and it is only as a whole person that a person is taken up by aesthetic life. Those of us who are used to thinking of philosophizing as an activity of the mind, we may have to be initiated into philosophizing with our bodies as a prelude to what is primordial philosophizing that transcends the mind-body dualism. This transcendence allows for the coming together of philosophy and aesthetics in that wholeness that constitutes our life. This coming together is such that it undermines the attempt to construe or to project aesthetics merely as a branch of philosophy. Philosophy is aesthetics, and it is only as such that it can reveal what is essential about aesthetics. If it is granted that aesthetics has to do with the sensuous, for philosophy to say anything about it, it can only do so from the standpoint of the sensuous. A philosophy that is adequate to aesthetics must dwell in the audible, in the tactile, in the visible, and in short, in the world of the sensible, not simply as an observer, but as a part of the sensible. It is to reveal what is essential about African musical aesthetics. It must dwell in African music, and music that is by what is distinguishing itself in the sensuous. In the light of the multiplicity of traditions, the sensuous is subject to multiple perceptions, to multiple interpretations, and to multiple constitutions. The modern sense of the sensuous in the West has been mediated and remains mediated by Christianity. To the extent that the West claims to have appropriated the Hellenic sense of the sensuous, this appropriation has also been mediated by Christianity. Hence, when the West understands aesthetics as that which essentially concerns itself with the sensuous, the understanding of the sensuous in this context must be put into the proper context. One must take the Christian interpretation into account. What they have in mind as the sensuous is not to be assumed to be identical with what the Greeks had in mind. To get at to what the Greeks had in mind, the dissedimentation of understanding is critically important. For Christians, the sensuous is inferior to the spiritual, and if it is given some value, as it is in aesthetics, it must be because it is the vehicle of the spirit. It is the spirit that is taken on the flesh. Art, in this view, takes what is merely sensuous, material, and elevated it to the spiritual. It is only as such that it attains an aesthetic quality. What the Greeks had in mind was something entirely different. For them, aesthetics was not the spiritualized sensuous. It was not an incarnation. It was the elemental sensuous that knows no boundary between the sensuous and the spiritual. Not that one had to become the other, but because what is elemental does not allow this dichotomy. The elemental sensuous has nothing to do with the Christian sensuous or the modern empiricist notion of the sensuous, and it is not to be understood as that which is in opposition to the spiritual. Perhaps this elemental sensuous is best characterized as physis. The Hellenic notion of aesthetics is akin to the African notion of aesthetics. Let us recall that for Christians, the Hellenes were pagans whose perception and understanding was removed from truth. In the eyes of Christians, the Hellenes were not only prisoners of the sensuous, they were also prisoners of sensuality. Even their gods and their religion were manifestations of the sensuous and the sensual. These are precisely the charges that Christians leveled against the Africans. The devotion to and obsession with what is carnal in Africa shocked the early Christian missionaries in Africa to the point at which they were not sure whether Africans had souls. Between Africans and Christians, there was not a shared sense of the sensuous. Aesthetics did not have the same meaning in the two peoples. De-Christianization of aesthetics is a prerequisite for those who are interested in understanding of African aesthetics today. When an African drummer drums, he does not infuse the drum with spirit, and the rhythm that is triggered by the drum is not an embodiment of spirit. The drum is the drum. The rhythm of the drum is the rhythm of the drum. The vibration of the drum is not the embodiment of the spirit. It is the vibration of the drum. This does not mean that one has to resort in physics to explain this vibration, just as one does not have to resort to the chemistry of the drum to figure out what it is. Materialism, in either case, can only lead us away from grasping what is essential about drumming. For those in the West, a return to the original Greek perception and understanding of aesthetics may be helpful in this process. The physical-spiritual dichotomy was not the irreducible principle for the onto-existential explanation of aesthetics. What the Greeks thought by aesthetics should be recovered from the dirt and dust that has been produced by Christianity. This means a recovery from a Europe which poses as the era of Christianity. Even if it Even if one were to argue that Christianity has not distorted the sense of aesthetics, it must be noted that what passes as aesthetics in Christendom should not be taken as what passes as aesthetics in all traditions, just as is the case that we should steer away from approaching aesthetic life simply as intellectual life. We should equally steer away from approaching aesthetic life simply as a facet of emotional life or as a facet of the life of feeling. It is, indeed, tempting to construe aesthetic life as that form of life that defies intellectual grasp, the life which cannot be reduced to categories of thought. In succumbing to this temptation, one finds oneself embracing the opposition between emotion and thought. If philosophy is conceived as an intellectual life, one finds herein philosophy standing in an irreconcilable opposition to aesthetics. As aesthetics standing in an irreconcilable opposition to philosophy, aesthetics becomes inaccessible to philosophy. Such an opposition easily calls to mind the opposition between mind and body, with philosophy siding with the mind and the aesthetic siding with the body. This Cartesianism obscures not only what philosophy is, but also what aesthetics is. Ultimately, this Cartesianism presents us with a vision of human life that is in irreconcilable opposition with itself. Philosophical life, as is the case with aesthetic life, points to the essential unity of human life. Insofar as each points towards this end, each inherently embraces the other to the point of laying out the essence of the other. In doing so, there is no irreconcilable opposition between them, as each receives its full measure from the other. Insofar as it is human life that is at stake, a philosophical life that has no place in its essence for emotional life negates itself as philosophical life. Similarly, an emotional life that has no place in its essence for philosophical life negates itself as emotional life. Human life is whole in every one of its manifestations. Properly grasped, a whole is not a mere addition of philosophical life and emotional life. Human life is a unity that is irreducible to these two facets of life. An inquiry into aesthetics is an inquiry into life by the living. It is living inquiry. To inquire is to open oneself to that which is to inquire is to open oneself to that which one is inquiring, and presupposes a positioning of oneself in such a manner as to appropriate that which is offered by that which one inquires. The appropriation can take place only to the extent that the inquirer is appropriated by that which is inquired. Whenever and wherever this reciprocal appropriation is successful, it annihilates itself as appropriation and leaves both the inquirer and that which is inquired in the very manner in which they are. Each becomes open to the other without ceasing to be itself. What is preserved is the openness that each is. Thus, to inquire is not to seek masterly over what one inquires, or to seek a digestion of what one inquires. It is to stand in the clearing of one's life in the light of the clearing of what one inquires. It is to embrace that openness in which the inquirer and the inquired enter into that intimacy in which each becomes the living flesh of the other. In all genuine inquiry, the dialectic of the master and the mastered gives way to that which is beyond this dialectic, to the non-dialectical. The intimacy that aesthetics reveals as belonging to the very essence of human life gives rise to the awareness that each one of us, to the extent that he or she is living, is open to everyone else. I am open to you, and you are open to me, and we are open to other human beings. Musical aesthetics in its African context. Musical aesthetics in its African context, the site for this openness. But life does not solely open one living individual to another living individual. It also opens one living community to another living community, one sex to the other sex, one race to the other races, one society to the other societies, one culture to the other cultures, and one age to other ages. It engathers all that which lives unto itself. Life does not screen itself from itself. It diversifies itself without abandoning its essential unity. It is this task that must be accorded to aesthetic life, and it is the task that at present demands our attention. It demands our attention precisely because all too often we are neglectful of it. Our life is such that it tends to annihilate itself. We fall into this mode of being whenever we attempt to screen life from itself. This may happen whenever we establish a screen between ourselves and others. When life is lived in a manner that calls for an erection of a barrier between us. We are all quite familiar with the claim that aesthetics is a matter of personal taste, implying thereby that each human being is closed off from other human beings, or when it is claimed that every culture or age has its own aesthetic taste, implying that each culture or age is enclosed onto itself. As is well known, the discussion of beauty pursued along this line of thought rarely goes anywhere. As soon as it starts, the conventional wisdom that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder is brought to bear on the discussion, and the discussion thereby ceases, since each view lays an incontrovertible claim to what is beautiful, whether it is or it is not contradictory to other claims. Instead of opening and the ingathering that we have associated with aesthetic life becomes the principle of closure. Each individual life is sealed within itself. Aesthetics becomes a fencing off. Here the issue is not whether one should abandon human particularity in favor of abstract or universal humanity. The issue is how one is to live one's particularity in a manner that is becoming of a human being. It is how one leads one life without abandoning it, that which ingathers all of us as human beings, that without which we cannot truly be human. In other words, the issue is how is one to indulge oneself in aesthetic life without alienating oneself from oneself. In aesthetic life, there's ecstasy. In it, each one of us stands outside himself or herself, bearing everyone to everyone in a manner that reappropriates each one of us to that fundamental mode of life that constitutes our human being, or that constitutes our being human. Yeah. So in it, each one of us stands outside of him or herself, bearing everyone to everyone else in a manner that reappropriates each one of us to that fundamental mode of life that constitutes our being human. But the ecstasy in which aesthetic life ushers us does more than simply bring us to a common yet individual life. Life ingathers not only human being, it ingathers what lives insofar as it is living. Life ingathers animals, plants, and whatever else lives into the same essential fold as human beings. Human life is open to animal life, to plant life, and to whatever else that is alive, and reciprocally, these other living beings are open to human beings. In other words, whatever is alive claims human life, while at the same time human life claims whatever it is alive. If, as it has been indicated, aesthetic life brings us to our essence as living beings, it brings us more. It brings us to more than ourselves. It brings us to that life that we share with everything else, that we share. Okay, it brings us to that life that we share with everything else that lives. We are transcended, only to be reclaimed back more profoundly. This calls for an amplification of the previous claim that was made, namely, aesthetics is a human ontology. It must not be claimed that aesthetics is bio-ontology, the logos of the being that lives. Indeed, we appear to be led to the conclusion that aesthetics concerns itself with everything that is. We are led to this conclusion primarily because nothing is foreign to what lives. The very thought of something that is not living brings what is thought into the intimacy with what is alive. What is thought is a facet of life. That which transcends life is unthinkable. The unitary aspect of aesthetic life appears to be, for the most part, concealed. We are often lost in this or that facet of aesthetic life, and neglect, disparage, or be indifferent to other facets. We may, for example, conclude that the essence of aesthetic life lies in music, painting, weaving, architecture, dance, in speech, or in poetry. Any one of these facets of aesthetic life may negate its aestheticity by constituting itself as the sole expression of aesthetic life. In its essence, aesthetic life does not take sides with any of its facets. It is the same in all its facets. It bears the openness that is its essence in whatever facet it expresses itself. Hence, the musician, if he or she is truly an embodiment of aesthetic life, will find him or herself open to the weaver, to the painter, to the poet, to the farmer, to the shepherd, to the blacksmith, and to all those others who have been taken over by aesthetic life. Human beings are not the masters of aesthetic life. Aesthetic life masters human beings in their belongingness, not only to one another, but to everything else that is. This unitary belongingness breaches not only the absolute autonomy of the specific facets of aesthetic life, but also the absolute distinction between the fine arts and crafts. Likewise, it breaches the absolute distinction between human creations and natural creations. The distinction tends not only to denaturalize what is human, thereby creating the opposition between what is human and what is natural, but also raises the possibility of placing what is human above what is natural. If it is borne in mind, what is human is natural. There is nothing that human beings can generate that contravenous what nature generates. Human generation is natural generation. Rather than set as a part or in opposition to what is natural, aesthetic life opens us to what is natural and opens what is natural to us and gives rise to the common belongingness. As what is human is naturalized, what is natural is humanized. Because what is human is alive and what is natural is alive, aesthetic life not only opens us to ourselves as living, it also opens nature to us as living. Too much humanism destroys aesthetic life. Aesthetic life is more than human life. It is not essentially a celebration of human life at the expense of all life, and it does not affirm the supremacy of human life over all life. It affirms the releasement of human life into the general stream of life. Human life is essentially what it is by being lost in this stream, a loss that is at the same time self-recovery. The life that aesthetic life expresses is not a life that is in opposition to that which is not alive. Life leaves no room. Life leaves no room for that which is not alive. It pervades everything that is. The rocks that lie in my visual field are alive insofar as they are part of my visual field. A visualized field is a living field. It knows no boundaries between itself and whatever enters into it. It is to be entered. Visualizing is an expression of life, and it cannot have contact with what is alien to it. The music that I hear resonates with life, if only because hearing is living. In doing so, it gives rise to that ambiguity in which it is no longer certain whether I am the one who animates it because I'm alive, or it is it which animates me because it is alive. In hearing, there is no separation between what is heard and what hears. Such a separation would only nullify hearing. To hear is to hear oneself, and it is also to hear what is other than oneself. What is true of visualizing and of hearing is equally true of all other ways of sensing. All the ways of sensing are unified in sensing, and it is only in this mode of their being that what is accomplished by either is likewise accomplished by others. The manifestation of sensing is made possible by what is sensed, and what is sensed is manifested by sensing. Any attempt to separate the sensed from sensing or vice versa annihilates both of them. Likewise, any attempt to separate both what is alive from what is not alive will only lead to the annihilation of both. It must therefore be noted that life ingathers not only all that lives, but it ingathers all that is. It is to this ingathering of all that aesthetic life calls our attention. Aesthetic life draws our attention to our belonging to all that is. It releases us to all that is so that we can truly be ourselves. In it, man does not stand out. Standing out is surpassed by all that is can stand out and reveals us to ourselves as belonging to it in the very manner that everything else belongs to it. Our stance as subjects gives way, and as it gives way, any objective mode of being that will sustain the stance of subjects equally gives way. What remains is life that is non-polar. We have previously stated that to write about aesthetic life or to speak about it, one must do so aesthetically. Now we add that this is equally true of reading about it or hearing about it. The writer and the reader, the speaker and the spoken to, as is the case with the thinker, and he or she who attends to thinking share in common aesthetic life. It is in this sharing that constitutes that openness that essentially belongs to aesthetic life. We herein find ourselves with an openness that is not emptiness, but rather an openness that is full. We find ourselves claimed in our essence by full openness. Without partaking in this full openness, what is aesthetic withdraws. And in this very withdrawal, our own essence withdraws from us. We are rendered empty in our being. In such a state, aesthetic life does not make sense, since aesthetic life is characterized by the fullness of openness. When we are rendered empty, such emptiness cannot be overcome by filling it. The fullness of openness is not a replacement of an empty container. We are not empty containers to be filled by the fullness of openness, and neither is the aesthetic world. If the fullness of openness is a replacement, it is a replacement of nothingness. Since nothingness is not something, any attempt to create a hiatus between it and the fullness of openness is a priori doomed to failure. Nothingness is intrinsic to the fullness of openness, and openness is intrinsic to nothingness. Where and when nothingness takes up and makes us appear to ourselves as essentially belonging to it, and when and where we ourselves take up nothingness and make it appear as essentially belonging to us, there is aesthetic life. Nothingness appears incomprehensible to us because it is what it is. It is nothingness. When nothingness is therefore brought to bear on aesthetic life, do we not run the risk of reducing aesthetic life to incomprehensibility? In response to this question, two observations are in order. When nothingness is brought to bear on aesthetic life, it must not be forgotten that it is precisely nothing and not something that is brought to bear on aesthetic life. If nothingness is brought to bear on aesthetic life, nothing is brought to aesthetic life that is extraneous to it. Aesthetic life remains what it is. What then is the sense of bringing to bear if nothingness is brought to bear on aesthetic life? And if there is nothing extraneous about that is introduced to aesthetic life? Nothingness can be brought to bear to aesthetic life because aesthetic life is what it is by harboring nothingness in its essence. Aesthetic life stands in opposition to nothing, and bearing in mind that nothing is nothing, the opposition between aesthetic life and nothingness is non-oppositional. Bringing to bear means letting aesthetic life stand out as aesthetic life. The second observation is that life, that in which aesthetic has its being, is for the most part taken for granted and hence poorly comprehended, assuming that it is indeed comprehensible. As soon as one attentively focuses attention to life, one finds out that one cannot put a finger on life. What one puts a finger on is other than life. Moreover, fingering itself is living, and just as one cannot see as one sees. Moreover, fingering itself is living, and just as one cannot see seeing as one sees, or hear hearing as one hears, one cannot live living as one lives. The lived living does not allow itself to be lived, to be delimited, or to be subjected to boundaries. Living is inconceivable. It is ineffable, even if it is that which gives rise to conceivability. The point of one's birth viewed from one's living standpoint is an abstracting just is an abstraction, just as is the point of one's death viewed from one's living standpoint. Living is not a linear continuum from the point of birth to the point of death. For the living, these points are experienced as pointless. To not be pointless, one who is living would have to be, therefore, one who begins to live. And one who is living would have to be living after one has ceased to live. Either of these modes is being absurd. One cannot even have a living standpoint upon which one can intelligently focus attention on one's point of birth or one's point of death. A living standpoint would give living the intelligibility which it does not have for a living individual. From a temporal perspective, where I am living as a living being, unintelligible and incomprehensible, it is only abstractly that I can try to figure out where I am relative to my birth and to my death. Living does not allow itself to be so figured. For me, my death is going to be as mysterious as my birth. And if both my birth and death are mysterious, that which supposedly lies between them, my living inescapably mysterious. What is mysterious cannot be bounded by that which is not mysterious, for it would be thereby cease to be mysterious. Life is the mystery in which I am mysteriously given. To live is to live mysteriously. Others may seek to dispel this mystery by fixing my birth or my date, but that which is so fixed is neither life nor my living. The absurdity that results may not strike others as such, but this may be due to the fact that they have not made an effort to come face to face with their own lives. I am what others are, and nothing touches me as a living being without touching others as living beings. Likewise, what others are as living beings is what I am as a living being, and nothing touches them as such without touching me as a living being. The inconceivability and the incomprehensibility that life is integral to aesthetic life. If this appears to have been invalidated or contradicted by what has been said, what have been said may have been misunderstood. What can be said essentially about aesthetic life is it can only be said aesthetically. To say what is said aesthetically is to say it in such a way that it is said effaces itself in the course of being said. One says without saying anything, and one hears without hearing anything. In so saying and in so hearing, aesthetic life makes itself present and allows itself to be approached aesthetically. What one says and what one hears is life. Saying is living and hearing is living. Thus, neither saying nor hearing is simply a matter of a bodily organ. To grasp what is essentially to say, it is not enough to focus attention onto the tongue. And to grasp the essence of hearing is not simply to focus attention to the ear. Every organ of the body is what it is by laying claim to the whole of the body. And as a living organ, it is what it is because it claims to be the living body. See, every organ of the body is what it is by laying claim to the whole of the body. And as a living organ, it is what it is because it claims the living body. It is only in the context of the lived body that the word is truly the word, and thereby is able to give rise to the possibility of being uttered and being heard. As that which is said and that which is heard is the word incarnate. It radiates from living corporeality and is directly directed to the living corporeality. What has been said about aesthetics applies to what is African and to what is musical. Aesthetics can be a key to the understanding of both Africa and Africans. It can also be a key to the understanding of music. This key will open the understanding of both African and music to us, and it will open us to self-understanding. The African self is aesthetic and it is musical, provided that we understand what is at stake. Provided that we understand what is at stake in African musical aesthetics, we will thereby understand both Africa and the Africans. Unless we take the absurd and stupid view that Africans are not human beings, By understanding Africans, we will have an understanding of what it is to be human. Moreover, provided that we understand Africa, we will have an understanding of the earth, the heavens, and the rest of the environment. We will have an understanding of nature, not the nature that has been constructed in the West by modern science, but that nature that is inhabited by and inhabits the non-scientific human being. Modern science has not only constructed nature in its own image, it has also constructed being human in its own image. African musical aesthetics seeks to take us to what is prior to these constructions, that is, to a pre-constructed nature and to a pre-constructed mode of being human. It de-objectifies being human. It resists objectification of being human. And because it is not humanism, it also de-objectifies being in general and resists the objectification of being in general. It relaxes, it frees, and celebrates relaxation and freedom. It is the source of relaxation and a freedom, and it is the reservoir of relaxation and freedom. It gratifies primordial yearning for attachment to detachment. It is ecstatic, a corporeal ecstasy. The way to African musical aesthetics is an integral aspect of African musical aesthetics. African musical aesthetics does not lie at the end of it. It is in it, and it is that which guides the movement to itself. Moreover, it is not laid out in front of oneself so that one can travel on it. One's very own being is implicated in it. This is the case whether one is African or not. To be on the way to African musical aesthetics, therefore, is to be on the way to oneself. If one feels frustrated because the principles that distinguish African musical aesthetics have not been laid out, self-examination may be in order. Surely, one may be tempted to believe that there is something that remains unsaid about African musical aesthetics if, for example, it is to be distinguished from Chinese musical aesthetics or from other types of aesthetics. This assumption that presupposes an understanding of what is Chinese musical aesthetics or what is other musical aesthetics that one contrasts to African musical aesthetics. These presuppositions need to be challenged. It is the very essence of musical aesthetics to challenge these presuppositions, especially if these qualifications of musical aesthetics are dependent on musical aesthetics for intelligibility. What remains unsaid about African musical aesthetics remains as such, and by remaining as such, it constitutes an essential aspect of African musical aesthetics. This does not account for the uniqueness of African musical aesthetics. In general, all types of musical aesthetics retain as a part of what they are what remains unsaid. This does not imply that what is said fails to do so adequately say what can be said about musical aesthetics. It does not imply that what is said fails to do adequately say what can be said about musical aesthetics. What remains unsaid completes what is unsaid. End of chapter 1.